one of the reasons I love to come out and speak to groups like this is that it often starts a conversation. We get to learn a little bit more about you. You get to learn a little bit more about me and us at Avvo. And so hopefully this will be the start of some fun conversations with all of you. All right, so a demand-driven practice. What is that? Well, demand-driven is just one of those big business words to say that you understand your customers and you're responsive to them. But the challenge, and especially in legal, is our brains get all fried when we start thinking about these business issues and we feel that we don't have the capability to understand what is going on. And so one of the things I'll do as part of this speech is set up for you what I see happening at a macroeconomic level in other industries, including the legal industry, and talk about how you can take some of the things that are happening at that macro level and apply it at a micro level in your practice. Okay, so we start with this slide because I can't help but feel that we're living in some pretty crazy times, whether it's at the world level, whether it's at the national level, at the NFL level, but even in legal. Anytime you go to any conference or you hear your Supreme Court talk or speak to the Bar Association or even groups of lawyers getting together, we know that it's harder to practice law these days. What's weird, though, is we can't totally put our finger on it. Like watching the Supreme Courts or the bars attempt to think through how they can help you as lawyers, they go, "Guy, I know there's an issue, but we're just not sure what to do about it." Right? That's that tumult. And here's what's interesting. A lot of bars, a lot of Supreme Courts will say, the problem is that there are too many lawyers. But that's not true. And in our guts, we know it's not true. It's just an excuse. Lawyer numbers are constant. And by the way, law school applications, they've been cut in half. So you'll have fewer lawyers coming through. The issue is not our numbers as lawyers. The issue is because our customers are turning away from us. Our customers are abandoning us. That's the problem. So when we think about tumult, when we think about all this wash and getting caught in it, there is a place, either at a world level or a national level, or even a legal level, where there's been a lot of stability. And it's right here, with demand-driven marketplaces. Now, I guarantee when I put those logos up there, every one of those logos, for the most part, I hope Avvo's included, but you have a very positive, fun reaction to that. You go, God, I have a lot of great feelings interacting with every one of these brands, whether it's Snapchat or Uber or Facebook or Airbnb. We're all using these. And what's interesting is these brands have become fundamental to our lives in just the last 10 years. How crazy is that? I mean, every one of these brands is powering a big part of our lives, and it's just been 10 years. How did they do that? So this is where we get a little academic and a little macroeconomic, and I'll take you through all of these pieces, but it tells a pretty interesting story. So the consumer supply chain, we have suppliers. They're the people that manufacture and deliver the goods and services. Then you have a distributor in the middle who usually is an expert at reaching the end user. In this instance, we'll just call it the consumer of those goods and services. And that's a supply chain. That's it. Supplier delivers the services to the distributor, goods and services to the distributor, and they hand it off to the end user. So backward integration. This is where supply chains were for hundreds of years. Okay, so anytime you had a somewhat fragmented collection of suppliers, you had distributors who got pretty smart and said, I think there's something we can do here. So we have all these suppliers going to the distributors, going to the end users, and they said, if we can lock up a large amount of that supply, well, then we can dictate more of the activities and economics within the supply chain, and we can force those consumers to come to us. That was classic supply chain management for years. So let's use as an example, taxi drivers or taxis. So if we go way back from the like early buggies all the way into the early cars, you had people that just kind of drove around big cities like New York, and they picked people up. And then the cab companies and the dispatchers, which are kind of one and the same as we think of it from a distribution standpoint, they said, well, interestingly, if we can make a number of those cabs captive to where we own them, and then that evolved into actually having contracts with the city so that those could be the only supply was their supply that they've locked up, well, then that forces the riders to use our cars. And no matter how dirty they are, no matter how much they smelled, no matter if there was vomit in the back seat, you had to use them, right? Just think back 10 years ago, driving around in New York cabs. You're lucky if they even took a credit card. All right, similarly, in newspapers. In the last couple of years, I read Ron Chernow's book, Hamilton. Fantastic book, but one thing that struck me in there was that when you wrote something that you felt was that everyone needed to hear, like the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and the others went out and they found someone who had a printing press that could go off and publish their articles for them and help tell their story. And so you had people who were trying to tell fragmented stories, the supply being those stories, being the news, but you didn't really have this intermediary of the newspaper. You just had these publishers, these printing presses. Well, as that evolved, you had newspaper companies come in and say, well, what's interesting is if we can lock up the best news reporter and sports reporter and cooking reporter, et cetera, if we could take in all of these elements and make them ours, have them work as part of our news company, well, then we can pull in all of these readers and they're going to look, no matter how many advertisements we stick in there, whatever it is, we're going to have the readers come to us. And in many instances, they're going to read what we want them to read. And that's one weird thing that kind of bled into this, is a lot of politics then bled into the newspaper business because the readers were forced what the newspapers, the distributor, wanted them to read. Okay, now let's talk about lawyers and law firms. I don't think that this is quite as intentional as we saw around the newspapers or the cab companies, but law firms, I think it kind of evolved the other way around, where you had the suppliers with the lawyers who a couple got together and said, yeah, that works pretty well. And then more got together where they realized that if they could build a big enough collection of lawyers, and what's interesting is we talk about the firms, I think you could also put bar associations in the middle as potentially that distributor. But this idea that if you locked up enough of the supply and limited that supply to where someone had to come through the firm or at least had to use a licensed lawyer, well, then you could dictate who was using that supply. So no matter how complex the processes were, no matter how confusing the pricing was, no matter how lost the consumer felt, it didn't really matter because they knew they had to come to your firm, or at least they knew they had to come to a licensed lawyer that was owned by the bar association. Okay, those are 3 examples of the classic supply chain with the backward integration. Okay, so we've all heard the idea of an internet revolution. I actually call this a demand revolution, because whether you were the distributor or the consumer, everything changed with the beginning of Netscape. This is an early version of Netscape, but this was the first browser. I think it snuck up on me, and I think it sneaks up on all of you, to where for the first time, we were looking at this square box that was our computer, and as a consumer, we had access to all of this information that we didn't really even understand was out there. It was like just this incredibly, it was like a cold drink of water in an informational desert, to where we started to say, wow, I can learn a lot about everything I do in my life through my own research using my own computer. And on the other side of that equation, you had distributors saying for the first time, like, I have access to not the 15 or even 1,500 people in my locale, I have access to the whole world through the internet. This new interaction between distributor and consumer, so empowering. And that's why it is a demand revolution. And it shifted things, shifted the thinking from kind of, hey, if we build it, no matter how crappy, as long as we lock up the supply, the consumers have to come. They will come. Build it and they'll come. All right? Hope everyone gets the Field of Dreams reference. This is what the demand revolution looks like. It's not build it and they will come. It's mob rules. Now, you can take mob rules as something that's very negative. I actually like to think of it as very positive in that there is tremendous wisdom in the consumer masses. Tremendous. But you have to learn. I mean, the problem is that crowd is an underestimation of all the people that you can speak to in your practice. The number of people that you can speak to in your practice actually goes to infinity, right? When you're looking out at the sea of consumers, the sea of potential clients, it looks more like this. And so this is also a movie reference to The Matrix. And in The Matrix, you have our protagonist, Neo, who learns that he's actually a young person in the middle of a computer simulation. And he learns how to view the world through the binary code, through all the digits, through the data. And man, a big theme of what I'll talk about today, whether we look at it at a macro level or a micro level, it's about data. And I don't know how many of you in your practices are using all the data that is flowing through your firm every day, but you need to be. And this is a big gear shift for a lot of lawyers. When we started Avvo 11 years ago, I actually had so many lawyers say, come on, like, I need a website. I can't compete with those big I need a website? And now every one of you have a website. Like, that's not even a question. Okay, here I am again, 10 years later, you need to be data companies. And I know that feels big and scary, but if you don't look at data as an asset and learn how to harness it, you're going to get your behinds kicked by your competitors who get this, okay? We'll touch a little bit more on data and how you can harness it within your firm. Okay, so with the masses and trying to harness the wisdom of the masses, this is where you must start thinking about how you can become demand-driven and focus on communicating and understanding that end user for two reasons. So one, just with the definition of a demand-driven economy, demand-driven organization, demand-driven practice, the consumer demand drives the product and service development, okay? And so it's not what you think, it's not what you like, it is what your consumers are telling you. You have an infinite number of people to speak to. How are you going to speak to them, and how are you going to process those conversations? So a little bit more on the consumer demand driving the product. Here are a couple of finer points. So for one, the customer always knows best, all right? So in any customer who is interacting with you, they have a fairly finite collection of hopes and dreams. How do you decipher those? How do you get to understand them at a deeper level? and your biases are completely irrelevant. So I'm telling you, this is a massive problem with lawyers and the legal profession. I do a lot of work, both closed door and open door, with Supreme Courts, bar associations, et cetera. And the amount of times that I sit in those meetings and lawyers tell me what they think, I don't care what you think. I want to know what the consumer thinks. And from those conversations, I want to know what you know. And so when you watch bar regulation today, as they're trying to figure out, like, oh, too many lawyers and there's this big churn and we don't know what to do, it's a bunch of regulators sitting up there going, I think this, I think that. And the question is, have you asked the consumer? And we can get frustrated, but now I'll put it on you. As you think about developing your practice, have you asked the consumer? Have you talked to them? And I think the big benefit of that, it kind of splits in two ways for all of you. For one, there are a number of brands and intermediaries as distributors that you want to tap into because they will give you customers that you know that you want and need. And then also, if you get good enough at this, you can bypass the distributor. And you can go directly to these customers in those big pools where they tend to be hanging out. But you need to build a communication process. You need to have a system to where you say, these are the touch points with my potential customers, existing customers, past customers, and this is the data that we want to collect. And the result is that you end up you have great customer relationships because, it's like I guess I have so many movie references in here, but like Jerry Maguire, like you had me at hello, like you understand me. It's because you've taken the time to get to know them either on an individual or even on a broader macro level to where there's a type of customer, you've collected that data, you get them, and you almost know what they're thinking when they come in the door. Knowing them like that, having them at hello, that increases word of mouth. That's where people say, wow, this is a really thoughtful lawyer. I walked in the door, she knew exactly what I needed. She walked me through the process, she got me set up, and bang, I was out of there, and a week later, I got my expungement notice. That's the kind of experience where a customer goes, holy cats, can you believe what just happened there? And then they go tell their criminal friends. Targeting. The more that you understand your customer, as I talked about finding where they are, well, you can target people if you understand what they do, what they look like, right? So the more you understand them at an individual level, at a broader level, that allows you to go find them, and you might just say, whether it's Avvo or Etsy, you might say that I represent a lot of artists, and they have these types of issues. And if you have a very niche practice like that, then you decide, hey, there are certain outlets like Etsy or Artsy or any other art site where I think I could be drawing in customers. These last two data points on here are really, I should have them in big, bold letters because we're going to talk more about both of this. So again, I keep tickling this data word, but data fundamentally will become a core asset. Again, this is not hard stuff. You're communicating with the customers. You're learning all about them. Over time, you will build this core asset that is your customer data set, but there are all sorts of data sets that you can build. And then testing and measuring how you deliver your products and services will actually build that data set, build it out more broadly. And we'll talk much more about these two. But core asset and data and core competency in test and measure. Okay. Does anybody notice something on this page that is actually the BBC being a demand-driven organization? Right here at the top. Beta homepage. That is BBC putting out essentially an unfinished page. And it looks nice, but they don't know if they have the right stuff on there. And so they're asking their customers, do we have the right stuff here? Give us feedback. When we launched Avvo, The idea, we launched a beta website and everybody's like, oh, especially the lawyers were like, how dare you put out a piece of crap like this? It's gotta be finished, it's gotta be perfect. No, it doesn't, because we haven't talked to our customers yet. And we have gotten so used to, in the last 12 years, seeing incomplete products and services where people say, hey, we're putting it out there as a test and we're gonna refine it based on your feedback. That's pretty cool, right? That's what big companies do. Facebook, man, this is a slightly different flavor. Facebook is so popular because they've integrated so deeply with their customers that, the ads they show you is based on websites you visited or pages that you've liked, or even the content they're putting in there, whether it's promoted or from your friends, that gets pushed up by the signals from where you're telling them what you like and don't like. And so it leads to this customized experience where consciously or subconsciously you're saying to Facebook, like, you understand me. And because of that, I trust you. You don't waste my time. That's what the big companies are doing to tailor that experience. So let's take this back to the supply chain schema. And so demand-driven, so we talked about the backwards integration of supply to the distributor, to the consumer. But here's what forward integration looks like. And this is powering every one of those brands that has grown so aggressively in the last 10 years. The forward integration is where we flip the supply chain, and rather than integrating backwards with the supply, we get to know our customers on such a deep level that we integrate them. Now, this is not through some contract. It's not through anything we do that forces them to be with us. It's because they trust us and believe in us that they all are going to come to this core distributor that is aggregating them. And then what happens is it forces the suppliers, not the consumers, it forces the suppliers to modify their behavior. Okay? Now, this is what's going on in legal, everybody. This is where you're feeling the pain. I'll drill into this a bit more, but companies like Avvo, companies like Yelp, companies like Facebook, Google, are integrating so deeply with your customers that they're forcing you to modify your behavior. And that just drives you nuts. Because we have built this profession that has been backward integrated, and we have a monopoly, and we don't like it when people mess with the monopoly. So let's talk about some other industries. So we'll talk about taxis and news, and then we'll get to legal, just as we did as we talked about the backward integration. Okay, so tying up the taxi drivers, and then who came in and changed the game? Uber and Lyft. And Uber and Lyft spent a bunch of time talking to consumers, and this is what they told them they wanted. They wanted to be able to, on their mobile phone, call a taxi with the push of a button. And they wanted to know that it was going to be a clean car and there was not going to be vomit in the backseat. And they wanted to know when it was going to show up. And at a minimum, they wanted to be able to see when it was going to show up. They didn't want a tip, although that's changing now. And they had all these requirements where the consumer said, if you can deliver this to me, I will use this. And that forced all sorts of drivers to say, yeah, I think I can fit in that box. I think I can do that. I think I can deliver that. In fact, I'm kind of excited about it. Now, there's another element here that is important for legal, in that not only did they listen to the customers and modify supply behavior, they also modified who the suppliers were. And they basically said, okay, with all of these medallions that are locked up in the cities, et cetera, the yellow cab structure, we're going to have to go outside of that in order to deliver what consumers want. But it's all consumer driven, right? So they both modified the supply behavior and expanded who was defined as the suppliers. And this is why all the cab companies are going crazy and saying you can't do that. But it doesn't matter. The people have spoken, and these things are growing exponentially. Newspapers. Does anyone know, for the millennial set, where they get, there are all sorts of surveys out there, but it was really interesting around the election. During the election, where did millennials get the bulk, 60+% of their political news? Facebook. You go to boomers, and they're like, well, it's the nightly news, right? Millennials, it's actually Facebook and Snapchat. I don't know how many of you have teenage kids. I do. And their entire life is on Snapchat. And they are very thoughtful about, we have very political discussions at the Britton dinner table. They are so well informed. And I often say to them, like, where'd you come up with that? And they're like, duh, Snapchat. That's where they're getting their news, right? Now, what happened with Facebook in particular is I showed you all of that integration. In understanding their readers, they went back to the news companies and said, hey, if you want to get in front of our readers, you essentially need to put together more compelling content in general. It has to fit into a shorter reading window so it can be read quickly. Videos are good. Interactivity with different data is good. Photos, if you're going to have photos, we want them in a carousel. We want it to easy. They just have all of these requirements in order for you as a news company to display, to render, and render often within the Facebook ecosystem. But again, this isn't Facebook going, hey, we're the new sheriff in town. Well, they are a little bit. But it's all in the name of the consumer, right? Because this is what the consumers want and consumers need. Okay, so as we get to legal, it's a click different than the other two that we talked about, but it's still super relevant. And I hesitate putting all three of these brands up there together because I like to think of us, obviously, as very different. Basically, each one of these companies are similar in that they've taken a bunch of time to understand everyone that is attempting to interact with the legal profession and saying, what's hard for you? And they're saying things like, well, I really don't know what lawyers do. By the way, that's the number one reason they avoid lawyers. They don't know what you do. And so often you're like, well, of course, because you're dumb and you didn't go to law school. And so it's your fault. No, it's not. It's your fault. Like if we as an industry don't make ourselves approachable, they don't know what we do. So they go after things like forms and go to, it's do-it-yourself. The rise of the do-it-yourself industry is absolutely remarkable because we're not serving these clients. They also are deathly afraid that you're just going to run the clock and hand them a gargantuan bill that they can't afford. Those are the two things that are always at the top of the list. I don't know what they do, but I know they're going to be incredibly expensive. That's how they think about you. You're just a necessary evil because you don't attempt to understand them. You don't attempt to have them at hello. And the amount of hubris that we see, I talk to lawyers in and out, I talk to bars in and out, I talk to Supreme Court justices in and out. And the amount of hubris I see every single day in the legal profession makes me sick to my stomach. Because we have this attitude of like, these are they're kind of like poor people that don't really understand how awesome I am. That's the pervasive attitude. And we as an industry must get rid of this and start treating them like our customers. LegalZoom and Weavorce, interestingly, not only have they integrated with customers and are forcing some modification of the supply side, but they've also expanded the supply side, just like Uber. Now, where we're different is we're big believers that everything should go through a lawyer. There's do-it-yourself. We often joke that we're do it with a lawyer. So we want, maybe this is my own failure and bias, but if we can make the legal industry more accessible, everybody's going to be better off the consumer, and you, by the way, but really I'm focused on the consumers here, they're going to be better off if they use a lawyer and all of your tremendous knowledge and expertise. I want them to go to you. LegalZoom actually brings in people who are mostly interested in corporate, family, and trust and estates issues, and they handle their entry-level processes with paralegals or just clerks, just people who are processing the paper. They've expanded the definition of who can do legal work. Weaveworks, very similarly, through their arbitration, through their mediation, has expanded who is doing those services. And I think, while I might philosophically disagree with some parts of that, and as lawyers we can stamp our feet and say that's a problem, again, these companies didn't just pop up and be like, hey, guess what? We're gonna change how we think about the delivery of legal services. They listen to the customers, and those customers are voting with their feet, and all they're doing is providing them an avenue to walk down with those feet, right? And I realize I'm beating a dead horse, but it is not, as an industry, please take this away, it is not LegalZoom's or Weaveworks' job to modify based on what the supply thinks. It's our job as the supply to modify in order to speak to those customers. And this is how we do it a little bit. Now, the danger of trying to give you some more micro examples of how you can become demand-driven is that there are so many examples. It is a sea of ways that you can interact with your customers, and I'm going to show you some super basic examples, right? And I'm sure there is just like at our Lawyeronomics conference, there's a broad spectrum from the beginning marketer to the very sophisticated marketer. And however, when we're talking about anytime I'm associating what goes on with business in general with your law practice, more often than not, your brains freeze, again, because this is all big company stuff and you can't do it. So what I want to do is take it to some of the simplest examples so that we can get over that chasm and let you see that this stuff is not hard, you just need to get doing it. And I'll give you 3 examples. But this is really the chain. This is all we do at Avvo. We're pretty good at it, but this is what we do. So the first thing is how you communicate with your customers, potential customers, past customers, just anybody out there that might use your legal services. Then you need to build a test and measure philosophy within your firm. That's going to drive data, and that allows you to communicate better. I'm not totally happy with this schema because there's a lot of overlapping in all of this, but I think that cycle is a pretty simple and it's a good way to think about how these three things hang together. But you'll see a bit of the overlap in all 3 here in a second. So let's talk first about communication. It is not, like lawyers, you were taught how to communicate, right? You just were, but yet we make it hard. But think of all the different ways that you are communicating to clients. So you're constantly out there marketing in person or through some marketing channel, and you're trying to drive client acquisition. Or you're talking to your customers and trying to make them love you, and that's really just a form of client retention. Or you're trying to make those customers love you so they'll go out and tell other customers, and that's where you're trying to drive that word of mouth marketing. You're just always talking. You're always communicating, right? Just think of all the different ways that you're having conversations. Are you capturing the essence of those conversations? Are you setting objectives for what you want to learn from those conversations? Because if you're not structuring it, you're just talking. And where it gets really complicated is when we go back to trying to harness the wisdom of the masses so that we can bring in, or we can drive different objectives. One of those objectives possibly bringing in a specific type of client that maybe drives higher margin, drives the practice that we want to have, and it starts to look like this. I mean, it is that mass around you. And so what business people do in order to harness that mass is they set objectives of how they're going to communicate, and then they run some tests as to whether they're meeting those objectives. You don't need to be Don Draper. He's very handsome, but he's also fictional, right? This is all about the reality of you having all these conversations swimming around you, and you don't need to be the magician in the fancy suit and skinny tie. You just need to be intentional. And here's a couple of ways that you can have that intent. So, test and measure and data. What do these things mean? We could move these from side to side. By the way, more movie references, Breaking Bad. They did a lot of testing and measuring to build the best methamphetamine going. Back to Criminal, I guess, again. And this is Neo from The Matrix, and he being the ultimate data wizard to process the information that was around him. And so we could tackle either one of these first, but let's start with the test and measure. Test and measure, another big word, but it is just seeing what works. That's all it is, okay? And what we're trying to do, and I alluded to this earlier, we're trying to get out of the land of things. Anyone who's at Avvo that has been in meetings with me, I'm constantly telling the team, get out of the land of things. I don't care what you think, what do you know? And that is for your firm. I mean, just do this dissection right here. For those of you that have more than 2 humans in your office, how many times have you had 2 humans saying, I think this and I think that? Maybe the way you solve it is say, let's test them both. How novel. And then we can start arguing, stop arguing like lawyers and let the data do the talking. Right? So we got to get from we think to we know. All right. Let's talk about the scientific method just a little bit. I'm not trying to make this overly technical, but I just want to give you a process for your firm that I would ask that you walk through this in order to start testing things. All right? So the first thing is you observe some behavior. Hey, I'm not getting paid on time, and I'm not getting paid enough. Like some percentage of my clients, I have a higher deadbeat percentage than I think I should have. Okay, great. That's an observation. The next thing you do in the scientific method is ask a question. If we took credit cards, would that allow us to speed up the payment cycle and reduce the number of deadbeat clients that I have? That's interesting. Okay, so let's propose a hypothesis. If we took credit cards, could we speed up our revenue cycle, our billing cycle, by X%? Because, by the way, I've spoken to a couple of other lawyers, and they tell me that that's what should happen. Or could we reduce the number of non-payers that we have by X%? That's the hypothesis. Now, one point on running tests, and as you think about your hypothesis, start small. And we still fall into this trap at Avvo all the time. But is there a portion of your clients, to use this example of credit cards, that you can carve off and start having them take credit cards rather than rolling it out across your entire practice and then having to roll it back because it didn't work? Because that freaks out your clients. They feel whipsawed, right? And so to the extent that any test that you want to do, if you can, whether it's clients or whether it's for employees or whether it's for vendors or whatever part of your firm it touches, if you can reduce the blast radius of your testing, the better. And again, for anybody who's at Avvo, they'll often hear me saying, like, can we just reduce the size of the test to get the highest signal possible so that we're not messing up what we already do well? Okay, so you propose this hypothesis, and by the way, hypothesis is also kind of like objective setting in that you have to have some amount of thinking around what you're trying to do, right? Because to the extent you just go, let's see what happens, well then things move and you can't remember what you thought would happen in the first place. And also the other thing you get is a lot of people, especially in bigger firms, go, I knew that would happen. It's like, no, because we set the goal and you set it much lower. And so making sure you're setting those objectives, putting some numbers on paper of what you think will happen, an educated guess of what you think will happen, and then you test it, right? You test your hypothesis, you test your prediction, and you see what happens. And if you can do just these easy things in your practice, you will be shocked at how this method, which again, fancy word, scientific method, how this method starts to alter how you deliver products and services that are responsive to the end user. And then finally, the smaller test that you can run and measure its success, that allows you also to iterate to where maybe you start taking credit cards in one geo plus practice area and you say, okay, we got some data from that. Now let's try another geo. Let's tweak it just a little bit. Let's only take credit cards as it comes in through the website and see if that changes anything. And the more that you can just run these little tests to iterate quickly and understand what your customers are doing, the more that you can slowly evolve your products and services to better understand, to tailor for them their wants and needs. But also, one thing that's hard about all this is that what customers want evolves over time. And so you can stay ahead of that in understanding those evolving wants and needs. Okay, so I gave you the example of the credit card. Let me give you a couple of other examples that super simple, but I'm just trying to spark in your head some of the ways you might use this. Talk about communication. What about trying some different messages in your email? So a lot of you, I think, are becoming pretty good email marketers. We definitely see that within the Avvo community. And a lot of times, you're sending out emails to your customers, and for a period of time, they're opening them, and then they just stop, right? They kind of fall off a cliff. I have a lot of customers say to us, what's going on there? Well, let's try some different messages. Let's try a couple of different things. And so this is often referred to as A/B testing with all these consumer brands that I showed you in the technology world. Let's have an A version, and let's send it out simultaneously with a B version, and let's see what happens. And if you increase the open rate on the B version, well, now you've learned something, right? And then you take the B version, and if that's working for a while, keep working, but maybe if it only works a little, now you do a C version. And you run these versions simultaneously to learn what your customers are responding to. Ask clients for reviews after the matter. So, the hypothesis here is it's like, I think we do a pretty good job for our customers. I believe that we have a very high satisfaction rate. Okay, go measure it. Test pricing for your services. We're seeing more and more of this. Again, only 3 examples. And again, I started this with the danger, like I could give you 80 examples. And how we narrow down what are the right tests for you to be measuring in your firm is you need to start and say, these things are most important to me. I believe these things have the greatest impact on my firm, and start there in what you test. But a lot of firms, again, they're starting to believe us when we say that customers are turning away because they fear the pricing element. They fear that they're going to get this gargantuan bill that you guys are just going to run up the clock. Okay, let's test some pricing. Let's have an A/B in that isolating certain customers, we're going to offer them one price, and another set of customers, we're going to test either a fixed price or a different price. And that gets us to NEO, analyzing the data. Okay, this is where everybody's brain shuts off because they're like, I'm not a data scientist. I mean, data just feels scary. It's just big, and it's going to come and live in my sewer and come get me. That's how data feels. But it's just counting. That's all it is. That's it. Data is counting. I don't know how many lawyers say to me, I'm a lawyer, I don't do math. I hear that all the time. Please never, ever, ever say that in front of your business clients, ever, okay? Data is just counting. And so big companies like Avvo, how we count is we have all of these tools. Some of them are proprietary that we've built, but we rely very heavily on things like Google Analytics, and Facebook has an amazing tool for us understanding when we spend money, whether it's returning on our investment. But I won't go through each one of these, but they're for the big companies, not saying necessarily your firms. We collect our data through all of these through all these collection vectors, and then we organize the data in a very sophisticated data warehouse with a very big data team, and then we analyze it using things like Excel, but also visualization software like Tableau, et cetera. That's how the big companies do it, right? So the goal is to have as much data and as fast as possible so that we can learn from it and modify our behavior accordingly. And that's where those small tests become really important. So lots of data coming from small tests so that we can iterate quickly. That's a marketer's dream, right? So how do we apply this to you? Where can you get the data? So again, maybe I'll ask it this way. How can you count within your firm? So you have this whole team that is out there they're communicating, they're interacting. If you set objectives around what you would like to count and put a system together for counting it, your team will be incredibly valuable. As more and more of your marketing becomes digital, going through your website, going through third-party sites, et cetera, Google Analytics, the Google Search Console, these are all tools that are so robust and just sitting there waiting for you, just data galore, and how can you harness it and analyze it? And then I put Avvo just because we're one example of where we give you a dashboard. If you're an advertiser, we give you a dashboard so that you can understand the quality of the customers that are coming to you through Avvo. But they're whatever you might use. The hope is that they have that software, that dashboard for you so that you can learn from you can calculate your return on investment. And then I would just say organizing and analyzing data, Excel. Now, I know Excel is not something that you all went to school and learned how to use, but anyone that does your books, or you can even bring in college students to have them build certain Excel reports for you. You might have to farm this out, but it's there, it's for you. It's such a simple tool that you probably already own as part of the Microsoft suite. But that's where you get the data. That's how you count, collect it, put it in to the lines through Excel, hit total, see what comes out of it, okay? So let's talk about some objectives in collecting data as an example. So Ed Walters, actually from Fastcase, has a great article in the last ABA Law Practice Management magazine, which, by the way, I just think the ABA gets such short shrift because that magazine's awesome, and yet nobody seems to read it. Whenever I ask them, like, how many read Ed's article? Exactly. And it's full of amazing data in there. But one of the things that Ed talks about, and it was funny, I read it flying over and I was like, wow, that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. So if Ed, you're in here, you may have stolen my speech. But so, number one question of data that firms are trying to collect all the time is whether their marketing's working. And so the question or the observation is that maybe you believe that prospective clients are finding you more online than offline, than your word of mouth these days. And so whatever channel you're trying to test, how well do prospective clients turn into real clients? And then ultimately with this question, I'm trying to prove whether online marketing is working for me. Now, again, I don't, this is almost an aside, and I feel like I've been saying this for 10 years, and yet it continues to be this thorn in my side, so I want to share it with all of you. The number one easiest way, if you're trying to understand if your marketing is working, you don't even need to get Excel involved, is just ask people how you heard about us. And if they go as far as saying the internet, ask which site they came from. Just 2 steps. Like if you take anything away, can you take a picture of this and do it in your firm? Again, I seriously, I don't know, Bob Ambrosi, you probably heard me bring this up 10 years ago, and I'm still talking about it. And that's why sometimes I just want to jump out there and wrestle you guys down and say, simple stuff. Just keep it simple and ask these questions. And yet, I guarantee there are people in this audience who are like, no, that's unseemly. I don't do it. But let's say you do. Ask them. And if you ask them super simple stuff, now you can start tracking contacts and the quality of that contact. So you don't even need Excel. I've actually shown you the chalk. You can do this in your prison cell, okay? So TV, they said TV, I do 1 prospective client, 1 potential referral, and then you count across, okay? So 3 plus 1, 4, okay. So TV's working pretty well for me. Radio, only 1. Maybe I need to test some additional things. All the way down to this starts stacking for you which of your channels are working, okay? And then on that prospective client line, you can drill a bit deeper. Which of those prospective clients actually turned into real clients? Well, TV had 3 prospective clients, 1 turned into an actual client, and that gives me a conversion rate, one of those big business words, of 33%. And now I can go down and see which has the higher conversion rate. Again, if you want to do this by hand, go ahead. You put it into Excel, at least it won't get lost in your stickies in your desk. And it would be great if you had someone who was an operating partner or paralegal or office manager who was helping you with this so that you can focus on making legal goodness happen within your firm. But this is the kind of thinking that we need to do in order to drive data, which allows us then to drive the test and measure engine. So all you do then is track these numbers over time, and then you keep iterating. So I mentioned radio. Well, if you have a hypothesis that radio should work, make sure that you validate the hypothesis by asking around a bit. But from this, I'd say, okay, go test it again. Tweak a couple of things, and run an A/B test to understand why radio is not working for you. You might even chat with your clients to understand why they are not hearing radio. Like, where are you advertising your radio? And do your clients even listen to that station? Sometimes when you're measuring this stuff, it's really easy to blame the outlet. So we see this all of the time, and really make sure, this is a whole nother speech, but make sure that you have the right intake procedures within your firm. So actually, this is a huge problem at Avvo, to where we drive a bunch of volume for lawyers, and they have response rates at like 10%. And then they call to cancel. And we're just like I'm driving over there right now, because I want to put you in a headlock, and if you don't work, the advertising won't work for you. So make sure that you have, whether it's you or your associates or your office manager, that they're following up with people quickly and letting them know you care, because if you're not doing that, it's going to make all of your channels seem substandard. And then just a word about digital marketing before I wrap up. Really, I've told you a lot of things that are coming, and I think with this crowd, this is not a news flash. But digital marketing is becoming everything. And by the way, this is becoming everything. So you should be asking within your firm, how am I discovered through this device? how does my personality come through on this device? And can I acquire, convert, and monetize customers through this device? Mobile and digital, I mean, this is really just a form factor to deliver a digital marketplace, right? Communicate through it, test and measure through it, drive data through it. And if you don't have a strategy to develop your digital marketing, test and measure that digital marketing, and then ultimately get data out of that so you can iterate and improve your digital marketing, you're going to be working for someone who does in the not too distant future. That's the game. And so as you drill down, I just put an example in here, and I don't want to spend time having this be a Google Analytics seminar, but Google Analytics can give you all sorts of data about where they believe, where they see you getting your contacts. And if you measure, if you've asked the questions about your potential clients and you marry those two together, now you have two data sets that give you a stronger signal of where you are driving the most value from your efforts. And in the end, that's what all of this is about. Yes, it is the customer. It is understanding them at a deep level, but it's running a business. And it is, where do you invest your time and money in order to drive the highest return on everything you do? So being demand-driven, the core is the communication, flanked by test and measure and data, simple stuff that drives the modern law practice. Thank you very much.